Hello, I'm Infamous Sphere, and this is Period Drama Drama. My recent foray into the dried up and fly-struck world of Sarah Dane may have given some of you the wrong idea. Believe it or not all Australian period dramas are necessarily horrible. Some of them are directed by Peter Weir. Peter Weir is a director who you may not have necessarily heard of, but whose films you have probably seen. Before he became known in the international film scene, he was most notable for two period dramas. One was Gallipoli, the filmed account of the Australian military defeat, which nowadays we commemorate with biscuits. The other is a haunting tale of missing white woman syndrome, sparked by the bad decision to go on a picnic in the hottest and most horrible month of the year. This is Picnic at Hanging Rock. Ah yes, Picnic at Hanging Rock. This 1975 film is an adaptation of a novel by Joan Lindsay, and it does in fact include a picnic. On Valentine's Day in 1900, several students from Appleyard College in rural Victoria go on a picnic with two of their teachers at Hanging Rock, which is just one of Australia's many notable rocks. While there, four of the girls, Edith, Marion, Irma and the beautiful Miranda, decide to explore the rock itself, only for three of them to be somehow compelled to walk inside the rock and disappear. The fourth runs for help, but when one of the teachers goes looking, she disappears too. The police begin a frantic search for the girls, but find nothing. Speculation about the disappearance runs rife in the town, with people wondering whether the girls had been kidnapped or assaulted in some way. Two young men who saw the girls just before they vanished, Michael and Albert, take matters into their own hands and scale the rock themselves, searching. However, while there, they are nearly overcome by the malevolent energy of the rock themselves. Michael is defeated, but Albert manages to keep searching and finds one of the girls, Irma, still alive. However, neither Edith nor Irma can say what exactly happened while up on the rock. Edith manages to volunteer some information, but Irma can remember nothing. The students at Appleyard College are understandably distraught, for Miranda was revered beyond any other student. But no one is more affected than Sarah, an orphan who is ignored by most of the girls and bullied and belittled by the snobbish headmistress. Sarah had some sort of relationship with Miranda and clearly harbours more than sisterly affection for her. When Sarah learns that her guardian has stopped paying tuition fees and she will be expelled from the school, thus losing her only link to Miranda, she kills herself. Mrs. Appleyard, clearly feeling either some hint of guilt or an awareness of the threat of financial ruin at the thought of mounting unpaid bills and students and teachers leaving, commits suicide as well. And so, after the rock has claimed more blood than the boulder in 127 hours, the film ends. So what is it about this film that's worth considering? Is it just the niggling feeling of an unsolved mystery, or is it something else entirely? Picnic at Hanging Rock is a beautiful film with a wonderful ethereal mood, conveyed in both the floating languid cinematography and the haunting music. The mood is so effective, Peter Weir managed to wring malevolence and malice out of a rock. The film hinges on a number of dichotomies, between the civilised world and the wild landscape, between innocence and sexuality, and between the English-toned upper classes and the lower classes, who speak with an accent much more like modern Australian speech.
You're mad.
Yes, perhaps I am. But I'm still staying because somebody has to. Just because you lot are Australians.
You're a funny bugger.
Most of the schoolgirls were cast in South Australia. Peter Weir wanted actors who seemed both natural and disconnected from modern society. But potential insults aside, South Australia has a few distinctive characteristics that make it ideal for a period piece. Historically, it's the state most associated with wealth, as its first white settlers were free settlers, as opposed to convicts. Its upper-class heritage lives on in the distinctive South Australian accent, with its complete trap-bath split. If you want a group of refined young ladies who dance their way across the landscape, South Australia is where you're going to find them. Interestingly enough, by casting unknown, untrained actors, Weir realised that unfortunately many of them couldn't actually act. Therefore, many of the girls are dubbed in post-production. In terms of historical accuracy, Picnic at Hanging Rock is set in the very last year of the Victorian era, although many of the fashions tend more towards the Edwardian. It may seem strange, but I'm going to be talking a lot about fashion, for this is a human story, and fashion is nothing if not a reflection of the human condition, in more ways than one. Having the students dressed entirely in white is both historically accurate and also a bit of very obvious symbolism about the perceived innocence of the girls. Indeed, Sarah is one of the few girls in the film who doesn't dress entirely in white, and she's the one who is considered the most unworthy. This style of dress is called a lingerie dress, and there's not much perceivable difference between the girls in their nightgowns and undergarments and how they look when they're fully dressed. Which brings us to another theme. The idea that these girls are simultaneously innocent while also coming to terms with their emerging sexuality. A lingering threat is the idea that the girls and their teacher may have been sexually assaulted in some way, or that some kind of sexual mania overtook them.
Miss McCraw, she was going up the hill as I was going down. She was funny.
Funny? How?
Les pantalons. She had no skirt. Just les pantalons.
Drawers? You mean she was just wearing drawers?
Indeed, after Irma is rescued, she no longer wears white, but instead wears red, a colour commonly considered sexual.
I didn't know whether the sergeant should be told. There's no corset. Miss Irma's corset. It's missing.
When we're considering the sexual implications of the girls and the teacher discarding garments and romping around barefoot or in their underwear, we also have to pay attention to a more unusual symbol of sexuality and disarray. We have to think about their hair. In the Victorian and Edwardian eras, before the mass haircuts of the 1920s, there were very specific conventions about how girls and women should wear and arrange their hair. Long hair was seen as a feminine glory, but much like any other particularly feminine attribute, it had to be carefully controlled. Worn styled at all times, often in an elaborate fashion, pinned back and padded with wads of real or false hair. Wearing hair loose was considered either juvenile, as something only appropriate for young girls, or it was considered grotesquely, flagrantly sexual, as something which only a prostitute would do. Yes, much like the dresses, we have something considered simultaneously childish and sexual. What better way to represent teenagers? Most of the girls at Appleyard College have long, loose hair worn out, making the few exceptions particularly notable. Edith's extremely childish behaviour is reflected in her short hairstyle, a style Victorians would have associated with very young children, invalids or criminals. Whereas Mrs. Appleyard's faltering grip on her finances and her mental health is indicated by her rapidly deteriorating hairstyle. The contrast between raw sexuality and repressed decorum is even evident in the presentation of Michael and Albert. However, no matter how carefully styled and sexually controlled anyone starts off as, whenever they encounter the Rock, they come away having completely lost their control. But even when we're not considering hair or clothing, there's another strange thread of sexuality running throughout the movie. Simply put, the whole film is more than a little queer. Miranda, the most missed of the missing girls, is loved and revered at the school. The girls worship her, and it is her disappearance that creates the most anguish. Now, this might be because of missing white woman syndrome. Miranda was, after all, considered particularly beautiful, but there's also a hint of sexual desire about the whole thing, situational or otherwise. More than one woman seems attracted to her, but the most important of Miranda's admirers is Sarah. Sarah is an odd one out from the start. She's not allowed to attend the picnic, she's never allowed to forget her humble beginnings, and she is punished for wanting to be creative and different.
I know another piece of poetry by heart. It has ever so many verses, much more than the Wreck of the Hesperus. Would that do?
What is the name of this poem?
An Ode to St. Valentine.
I'm not acquainted with it. Where did you find it?
I didn't find it, I wrote it.
You wrote it?
Love abounds. Love surrounds...
No, thank you, Sarah. Strange as it may seem, I still prefer Mrs. Heyman's.
But most importantly, she's obviously in love with Miranda, who either humours her or loves her in return.
You must learn to love
someone else. Apart from me, Sarah. I won't be here much longer.
It is possible that Sarah's sexuality is yet another reason why Mrs. Appleyard loathes her and tries her utmost to crush her. There's sexual tension among the teachers, and there's also something potentially sexual about Michael's sudden interest in Albert. But queer themes aside, what's even more interesting is that unlike many other period dramas, which revolve almost entirely around heterosexual relationships, there's barely any heterosexuality in this film at all. Sure, we see the policeman and his wife, and Michael's aunt and uncle in companionable marital harmony, but aside from a few crude comments from Albert about the girls, and a maid and a groundskeeper having an affair, there's just nothing there that indicates any idea of heterosexual love, whether respectable or otherwise. The girls are all dressed like they're going to be married, but there's no groom for any of them. It's impossible to divorce this film from the Australian context. There's an obvious juxtaposition between civilised ladies at a finishing school and the wild unpredictability and lack of safety of the Australian landscape. From the start of the film, we know that the picnic is a bad decision, based on the fact that February is the most unpleasant month of the year. The temperature is typically in the high 30s to early 40s, everything is so dry, and the fire danger is so catastrophic that you can set the ground ablaze simply by looking at it too hard. The simplest explanation for the girls' delirium and the strange behaviour that causes them to go missing is heat stroke. However, apparently Hanging Rock in February is a good deal more pleasant than the rest of Australia, owing to its higher altitude. So if not the weather, why did the girls and their teacher disappear? Well, Marion, Miranda and Miss McCraw were simply following in a time-honoured Australian tradition, underestimating the climate and the harsh nature of the Australian landscape and dying as a result. Going missing in Australia is possibly even more common than going missing in Canada, a country with a similar reputation for inhospitable wilderness, extreme temperatures and dangerous animals. Explorers Burke and Wills and Ludwig Leichhardt are some of the most famous victims of the Australian landscape, but getting into life-threatening danger is all too easy here, and happens to this very day, whether it's heat stroke in the desert, being caught in a bushfire, or hypothermia in the mountains. Despite all the tired jokes of Australia's dangerous and deadly animals, if you wander into the bush here and can't find your way back, you're far more likely to die of exposure. So why did the girls disappear? Was it just a metaphor for their disappearing innocence and the loss of their childhood? Or is this some kind of Australian version of the Dyatlov Pass incident? More importantly, did it really happen? Well, no. This isn't a true story, thankfully, but it doesn't make it any less scary.
Everything begins and ends at exactly the right time.
Whether you believe that there's something supernatural at play, that the rock had some kind of horrible malevolent magnetic force and crushed them in its stony grip, or whether there's an explanation as simple as them being murdered by Ivan Milat's grandfather, what makes Picnic at Hanging Rock so memorable is that we don't know. There was no lecherous man lurking in the shadows. There was nothing. They just disappeared. And nothing is the scariest thing of all. So should you watch it? Despite the potentially dry subject of girls at a finishing school, this is a film that has the potential to stay with the viewer for a long time. The mood and characters are compelling, and the narrative staying power is impressive. And it's interesting to see a side of Australian culture not commonly portrayed in film. This isn't a comedy of larrikinism and mateship, nor is it a crass sideshow of our more outrageous wildlife. Instead, it's a story that could simultaneously take place anywhere in the world, while also remaining an interesting reflection of how Australian culture took shape. In case you can't tell by my accent, it's people like Albert who won the culture wars.
It's only a bloody dream.
So that was Picnic at Hanging Rock. And now, if you'll excuse me, I've got to go. It's hot enough out there to melt the skin off the back of your neck. Perfect weather for a picnic!
It didn't matter in the end how old they had been, or that they were girls, but only that we had loved them, and that they hadn't heard us calling. Still do not hear us, calling them out of those rooms where they went to be alone for all time.